Now, for our last technical session, let's talk about how Ready API supports advanced service virtualization through the fourth product, ServiceV Pro. What we will be discussing is the different protocols that ServiceV provides in terms of virtualization and how those different protocols and the different ways you can virtualize support many different use cases that are in service virtualization. So let's go ahead and look at ServiceV, the last product within Ready API for our third technical section. ServiceV Pro supports a number of different protocols, including SOAP and REST protocols, but we've expanded upon this to then support virtualizing existing JMS services, existing JDBC connections. So in terms of services that may need to be virtualized because they cause issues within your client's workflows, databases may actually be a culprit that halt these workflows because of missing data, especially if you're building testing workflows that surround a lot of different sets of data. So with this JDBC virtualization, I can virtualize those database transactions, get all that data within the Ready API system so that I can have a virtual service that represents it to utilize whenever the database goes down for whatever issues. Within Ready API 2.5, we've also expanded our support to include TCP virtualization. So with this new protocol, I can either from scratch or by recording a live TCP application, I can virtualize things like mainframe applications, IoT applications, many of which utilize this TCP protocol for quick data transfer, and then have that virtual asset to utilize within my testing or within any other development needs. So these virtual services aren't only locked into the Ready API suite. When we'll talk about deployment, they'll also be available to any user within your company that needs to utilize it for any workflow. So now, with those protocols that we support, there's a couple of ways you can actually start utilizing them and virtualizing them. The first way is by importing a definition format for WSDL or SOAP virtual services. So I can have my WSDL here. Whoops, I actually messed that one up. All right, I'll be taking a pause here. I will be starting from the definition formats that we support in ServiceV. All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. Now with those protocols that we support, we can actually start a virtual service in a couple of different ways. The first one is by importing a definition that may represent a SOAP or REST service. This can be something like a WSDL definition for SOAP, or a couple of different Swagger definitions, WADL definitions, and RAML for RESTful APIs. So with this, I can take all of the operations available for my web service and then draw out those operations to then virtualize, where I can implement the API's logic within our ease of use UI that I will show in a moment. This definition import works really well for the use case of when a client comes in, they have something in, let's say, a Swagger definition that is taking quite long to implement. So while that implementation is occurring, you can actually take the definition, import it into ServiceV, so that you can build out a virtual service as a prototype of that implemented or to be implemented API, so that testers and front-end developers can utilize this virtual asset for their specific workflows. And when the actual API is fully implemented, we'll have a front end already created. We'll have a testing workflow that we can kick off against the real API. So a lot of this work becomes more parallel. We won't have teams just sitting down for long periods of time without any work to do. So it'll really increase the efficiency and ultimately the time to market for these APIs that your clients are looking to, maybe send out internally or even monetize with a more public consumer base. So this is something that can be very critical with our importing of these API definitions for prototyping purposes. The next thing that we can do is actually record live API traffic. Now, this can be utilized for a couple of different protocols. We can utilize that for all of these actually, so that if we have any live services, either from a third-party vendor or from another team within the company internally, I can virtualize those assets in the case that they go down, they're no longer available, if they start returning a lot of erroneous messages, or if they just simply cost too much to utilize when I'm just building out my test case or building out integrations to it within my development. So we can see a lot of cost reduction as well when we create a virtual asset of a third-party API, for example. So that's what I'm going to show here today, is the empty REST virtual service, but I'm actually going to virtualize the Google Maps API to create a virtual version of it that I have full control over within my environment. So let's go ahead and create this virt service here. At this point, it's empty, and I'm not actually going to hard code any endpoints or responses at this point. I'm just going to set up my routing options. In regards to my routing options, I'm going to set ServiceV Pro to route and record a non-virtualized request. What this means is that ServiceV Pro will look at whether or not it has a response to any request that comes in. At this point, it won't have any because it's empty. At which case, it will utilize the endpoint that I'm inputting currently, so it'll just be the Google Maps API endpoint, and run that specific request that it doesn't know how to respond to the Google Maps API. ServiceV then will take that response that it gets from the actual service, record it in the back end, and then to the client that made the initial request, it'll give that response untouched. So from an end user perspective, from the client, you won't see any disturbances in the workflow. You won't actually have to inject anything into this third-party service to record it. ServiceV is just acting as a middleman in the process to then build out a virtual asset in the most non-disruptive way as possible. So now let's go ahead and actually see this in action. I'm going to run this virtual service. At this point, it's only running locally on port 8081. So any application within my local machine can access this. We'll talk about what that deployment process looks like in ServiceV, going into virt server, which is a server hub, and how that process is made very easy. So now to create the traffic to come into this virtual service, I'm actually going to go into SOAP UI Pro, where I have a basic data-driven test case that run through multiple city names and run it through that Google Maps API. Now I'm going to go ahead, make sure I'm pointing to the real service that I need to at port 8081, or sorry, not the real service, the virtual service. And now when I run this test case, we're going to see ServiceV start generating responses. So now it's generating all these responses that it's storing for further manipulation or just use of what's recorded. In SOAP UI Pro, from the client perspective, I have my last call that I made, which was for the San Jose city, as we can see here. And then I have my results that I expected back. And in terms of validations, my assertions have passed because none of the information was interrupted in any way. So from for the end user, for that client making the request, everything is working, they're happy. But now I have a virtual asset that I've started building out so that in the case that Google Maps shuts down or I have some issue with its connection, I have something to fall back on very easily. So now I'm going to disable this, and let's look at everything that was recorded and how we can further modify it. So what we have here is the incoming endpoint that it recorded. I only used one endpoint at this point. The outgoing responses, which were recorded, we have about 5 different ones. And then we have a dispatch style that was configured automatically. And this dispatch style is the API logic that ServiceV utilizes to dispatch a specific response for a specific request. So we have that information all created automatically that we can further configure. So let's break that down a little bit further. In regards to the responses, we can see, for each call, let's say for Boston, which was the first call, we can see our information in regards to what the status code returned was, what media type. We have the full JSON payload that I can make further edits on very quickly just from this editor. And then we have all of the headers that were utilized. So with this control, I can actually change these responses very quickly. So this opens up the use case for a lot of different things. Now with Google Maps, Google being the company that it is, a lot of times we wouldn't expect it to fail in certain ways. And because of this, we may build out testing workflows that don't cover certain edge cases. So to make sure that we do, a lot of our customers have looked to ServiceV to actually virtualize things like Google Maps to then modify the payloads that it offers with malformed content, maybe erroneous information, to create what has been called a negative virtual service. So that when I run my test case against this negative virtual service, I'll make sure that my test cases or even my front-end UI catches any edge cases that may cause rendering issues or should cause test case failures. And this can be all done very easily because of our full control of the virtual service. So now let's look at the dispatch style that was created. ServiceV supports a number of advanced dispatch styles like the query match, XPath, and parameter dispatch styles, which can look at each part of the request going from just a resource path to something specifically within the request body to then inform which responses are returned. So let's look at the parameter dispatch style that was configured automatically. So we can see, just staying with the Boston example, the rule that was created that looks at the key and address parameters that come into Google Maps, and then ServiceV noted to return that specific Boston response that it also recorded. So within this very simple to use rule-based UI, I can understand the kind of rules that were created and create new ones or modify them to include different conditional statements, including something as complex as regex or regular expressions. So now we have the API, the virtual service, fully recorded, at least for the data that I need for my testing purposes, for the UI developers to just create a front-end UI without actually pinging the real Google Maps service, which can be a costly action if done often enough. Now, on top of the virtual service, ServiceV has other functionality to also assist in creating a robust virtual asset. The first is the behavior configuration, where I can take into account hardware limitations, things like my server capacity, network limitations like latency of my available network, or just injecting error codes to randomly pop up within my API for testing purposes. So now when I build out a virtual service, especially something that's a prototype that will at some point be switched into a real API being used, I can consider within my architecture whether there's a limited capacity, whether there's limited connection bandwidth, so that when testers come in and UI developers come in to use this virtual asset, they'll have a realistic feel for how the API will actually act when it's fully implemented because of these hardware limitations. So this is something that fits more of a very specific use case, but a lot of our customers have success around using these capabilities. So it would be useful when you talk to your clients more about virtualization on whether or not this sort of simulation would be helpful for their use cases. You can also implement authorization headers being enforced throughout your whole service, things like the header authorization that starts with a bearer, bearer sort of representing a bearer token. And with this, we don't actually get a full-fledged OAuth 2 system, but again, we get a simulation for these testers and developers to understand that the API will require these assets, this header specifically, within the API call. So we have a very clear understanding of that. And when they switch over to the real API, they won't be thrown for a loop when their API calls start failing. So that's a couple of things within the virtual service creation. Something that fits also a more advanced use case is utilizing a data source similar to what we support within SOAP UI Pro. So I can utilize an Excel sheet, a file, or a JDBC database connection to pull out information that I want to incorporate within my virtual service responses. So if I have ID information or different values that I want to incorporate to create a dynamic virtual service, especially for prototyping purposes, I can do so very easily by creating this data source connection. And then within the response, I can point to this data source using the Get Data menu, very similar to SOAP UI Pro, to then signify that I want to iterate through this data set every time the response is dispatched. So we get all of this information to create very dynamic looking responses that are informed by your client's data set. So that's ServiceV Pro and how people can come in and very easily create a virtual service. In this example, going from a live service like Google Maps and creating a virtual version of that. Now, this works really great if I'm a single person working just on my local machine, but in a lot of different use cases, and as you talk to many different clients, they're actually looking for collaboration. Very, very rarely are we going to have everyone virtualizing the same asset, since that can be very inefficient and not really time effective. So within ServiceV, we've incorporated another tool called VirtServer, which is a server hub where you can deploy and run your virtual services within your client's company networks. So I can take my Google Maps service and I can make sure I don't have it already existing there, but I can just easily drag and drop it into VirtServer. I'll go ahead and run it. And now, my colleague David can come in and start utilizing this to then run against, maybe his development, maybe his testing workflows without having to redo any of the work that I've already done. So everyone within the company, all of these different teams can share in the value of virtualization very easily. VirtServer then has a couple of other things incorporated into it to then aid with further administration. So as we can see in my instance of VirtServer, I actually have, over the time that I've been using this, quite a few different virtual services. And orchestrating these dependencies can become a difficult task, especially if your client is looking at a serious virtualization effort of 50, 100, even more virtual APIs. So to help with this, we have a couple of things that we've incorporated. I'm going to stop here. Forgot to open the web UI. All right. the first thing that we've incorporated is a web UI that will let you run virtual services without having to open up the Ready API suite. This web UI offers everything that was offered within ServiceV, the ability to change ports, modify what's running, and then I can also look at what transaction logs that I want to create within the file system of this server, so that every time I'm running, many different virtual services, at some point your client may want to audit some of the requests and responses that came in. So these log files will be very informative to look at how or how your company or your client's company have been utilizing these virtual services, and especially to look at anything that has been underutilized within your testing or development processes to really cut down on any inefficiencies. The next thing we've incorporated is actually a command line interface capable of deploying virtual services and starting and stopping virtual services in Virt Server. So as virtualization becomes more and more a primary goal of these larger scale companies that utilize a microservices infrastructure, one of the key things that come in is, how do I build this into a pipeline? And with Virt Server, that command line interface allows your clients to go in, and before they even kick off their functional or performance tests, they can decide what dependencies they virtualize that are relevant and make sure that they're running before that the rest of those testing tasks continue within an automated pipeline. Now, this command line interface will allow you to integrate with any CI/CD system. Particularly for Jenkins, we've built out a native Virt Server plugin so that your clients just have a couple of text fields that are more intuitive to fill out and orchestrate a build process around virtualization. So that's ServiceV Pro. And within this section, hopefully, we have gotten the chance to understand a little bit more about how virtualization within ServiceV can help your clients with many different tasks that they're seeing as challenges around different APIs, and how deployment is made so easy with Virt Server and this very easy to use drag and drop and the web UI and command line interface. So with this, I'll pass it back on to my colleague, David, for our closing remarks here. So again, thank you everyone for watching, and I really hope we've all learned a little bit more about what Ready API has to offer, especially to have more informed discussions with your clients around our tools.
Hey, thank you, Stephen. Great overview of Ready API. I hope everybody got a pretty good sense for the product's capabilities and its breadth and depth. And I also hope you sort of realize that, a product with the sort of capabilities of Ready API, it's hard to do it justice in a 90-minute session like that. This is why we have the tier 2 training, which those of you that attend that attended this and passed the quiz will be automatically enrolled in that tier 2 training. But let's take a quick review of what we looked at today. We looked at functional testing with SOAP UI Pro. We went from there into load testing with Load UI Pro. And we finished up speaking about ServiceV Pro, which provides a these tools provide a comprehensive way to ensure the quality of your APIs and services. Now, what's next? You're here on Learn Upon taking you're here on Learn Upon looking and have reviewed the recording here. Next step is to take the quiz, which is right here on Learn Upon. Once you take that quiz, those of you that get 80% or better on the quiz will have the certificate available to them at that point, and you'll be automatically enrolled in the Tier 2 certification. Now, I also want to refer you to more information, downloads, all kinds of great stuff with blogs and videos and all kinds of good information at www.smartbear.com. And for pricing and licensing, for details about our partnership with your company, or any other information, don't hesitate to reach out to us at partners@smartbear.com. So with that, I'd like to add my thanks to Stephen and appreciate your attention, and happy hunting on the API front. We really appreciate it. Bye-bye.